Hey class, this week we're going to start working with databases, and this is going to be the foundation that we use for the rest of the semester. There probably will not be too many other classes that we do, or projects that we do that do not involve a database. So we're going to start with the very basics, and I'm going to show you how we can use the SQL compact database to create a database within the system, and then how we can access that SQL database, how we can insert records into it, and how we can extract records from it. Now, in a production system, this is not going to be the method that you typically use for creating a database and managing a database. Chances are you're going to use an outside program like SQL Server or Oracle or MySQL to do that. But the concepts that we can learn by doing the most basic connection with the compact database are going to be the same across all databases. So that's why we're going to start here. Visual Studio makes it easy to create a SQL compact database. If you go over into your Solution Explorer and you just add a new item to your project, one of the options that you can choose under data should be the local database, and you'll see that it's got database1.sdf. Let's just rename that to week2 database. And you can see it starts to add that over here on our Solution Explorer. It's also going to ask you whether or not we want to use a data set or the entity data model. This is a topic for another class, so we're going to use the data set and just click Next and Finish. And that's going to create the data set for you. You'll also notice over here in the Server Explorer, if you don't see Server Explorer on your screen, you might have to check down here in these tabs. It might be, you might have, Performance Explorer or Toolbox opened instead. You can go there. If you still don't see it, you can go to View and then Server Explorer, and that will open it up for you. But you'll see that in the data connections, it's already created a data connection in this project for that week2 database that I created over here. If we expand that, you'll all see that we've got two different items underneath the database. We have tables and we have replication. For the assignment this week, we just need to create the most simple of tables. You're going to create a student table in the assignment this week. If you just right-click on that tables, you can hit Create Table, and you can give your table a name. I think I said in the assignment to make sure that you call it Students. And then you can specify what the columns are that you want to add to that. The first column is general practice says the first column is going to be the primary key index. If you're not familiar with what a primary key is or an index in a database, I would recommend that you Google that. If you've had the database class already, that will help you a lot. A lot of this will be second nature to you. But if you hadn't, I'll go ahead and go over it. So the primary key is just basically what the unique value is that specifies everything within that table. So I'm just going to call this one my index. The next field over is it's going to specify a data type. If you look in the drop down, there's a lot of different values here that you can use. For my index, I'm just going to use an integer value, and then I'm going to set it as a primary key. And you'll notice when I do that, this allow nulls is set to no. The reason for that is because you cannot have a null or no value in your primary key. Next, we're just going to create a couple of other fields. We're going to create a name. I'm going to use the data type of nvarchar. Nvarchar is going to be one of the string data types that you can use. There's also regular varchar, which stands for variable character. The reason why we use nvarchar is because it allows more special characters in it. If you're curious as to why we do that, I would recommend that you Google that, and I'm sure there are plenty of articles out there that will tell you why we do that. The next thing that we have is the length of the field. Now in the integer value, it's set the default length to 4, and that's fine. That doesn't mean that it's 4 numbers. That means that it's 4 bits long. In the name, having it set to 100 means that it's going to allow 100 characters in the field. For a name, I think 100 characters is fine. You can adjust that if you want to. I'm okay with allowing null value field or nulls in this field. Null values in this field. Sorry, having problems talking tonight. I don't want this to be unique. I don't want it to be the primary key, so I'll leave those the same. Next, let's just say email address. Again, I'm going to use a character type of nvarchar. Let's make that a 200 length. Notice when I made this, I did not leave a space in between email and address. Technically, with SQL, you can have spaces in column names. I would not recommend doing that because that means you're going to have to start using special characters when you're writing your queries. It's going to be bad. You don't want to do that. So try to keep your column names all scrunched together with no spaces. Again, I'm okay with allowing nulls in this field. I don't want it to be unique. I don't want it to be a primary key. That's good for now. Just an index, name, and email address. We can work with that, and I can show you how to insert and read from it. So I'm just going to say OK. And you'll notice that over here it creates the my table, and if I expand that and look at volumes, you'll see I have my index, which is set to the primary key, and then a couple of different fields underneath that. So now let's get into writing some code to insert data into this table. Now, one thing I have already done on this project is I have already added the SQL Server Compact Edition namespace to my project. You shouldn't need to add a reference to it. You can see it's already there. You should just have to type in this using space and then system.data.SQL Server CE. Now this is not to be confused with using and then system.data. Notice I've got several different types of SQL that I can have here. There's the .SQL, there's .SQL client, and there's SQL Server CE. You want to make sure you use the SQL Server CE if you're doing this method of creating a database. If you use just straight up SQL, it's not going to give you the tools that you need to create the queries to insert data and extract data. SQL client is what you're going to use if you're interacting directly with an SQL database. We'll probably get into using that next week. So for now, just that SQL Server CE is fine. The first thing that we have to do is we have to create the connection string that we're going to use to connect to the data set. I am just going to create a string value. I'm going to call it constring. And we need to tell it where we're creating, where we need it to read the database from. Now, normally you would have a complex SQL connection string that you would put in here. It would have like the server name that you're connecting to, the database that you're connecting to inside that, username, password, etc. With the SQL Compact Edition, we can kind of cheat. It's a little bit easier. So over here in the data connection, I'm just going to click on that database, and it's going to tell me right here what the connection string is that I need to use. Right there. So we're just going to highlight that and copy it, and I'm going to paste it right in here. And this is the data source that we're going to be using. Now, first thing we need to do is we need to remove these extra quotation marks because they are not necessary in an SQL connection string. So I'm going to remove those. I'm going to go ahead and add my semicolon at the end here. And the other thing that we need to do, if you remember, backslashes mean something in strings. It means to do something special after this backslash. And when you are dealing with a directory path, you need to escape those backslashes just by adding a second backslash to it. So I'm just going to go through and add all those second backslashes. There we go. And now my little red line is gone off of that. You'll notice that we are getting a little blue squiggly line. This one is just saying that it's never used. In just a few minutes when I start using it, ReSharper is going to recommend that we create that a constant value. You can just ignore that from ReSharper. So after we have the string set, we need to actually create the connection object. And this is the object that we'll be using to actually connect into the database. And we're going to use the SQL Server CE command or connection to actually do that. So I'm going to create a new variable. I'm going to call it con. I'm going to set that equal to a new SQL CE connection. And you'll notice that there's two different parameter sets that we can use with this SQL connection. We can either use no parameters and just create a very empty object, or we can add the connection string into that command or that connection, which is what we want to do. So I'm just going to type the name of the string that I used to hold that connection string in there. Once we have the connection there, we need to open the connection, and that's as simple as typing in the name of the variable that you used, dot open. And that's going to actually use this connection string, go out and touch that file and open it as an SQL connection so that we can write queries into it and or write data into it using an insert query and extract data using a select query. Something that's extremely important with SQL connections, when you have a very large program with lots of different SQL connections in it, you need to make sure whenever you open a connection that you close a connection. I typically do that by going ahead and closing it right after I open it, just by entering in the close tag. And I know I just need to put my SQL or all of my SQL strings and commands and everything that I'm going to use against the database in between those two tags, in between the open and the close tag. So the first thing on the assignment that you have to do tonight is you have to create or you have to insert data into the database, and we're going to use an insert query to do that. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to write the query string, and we'll just call this QString. And we just have to write a very, very simple insert statement so that we can insert into the table that we have. If you're not familiar with SQL insert statements and select statements, I recommend that you go ahead and spend some time researching that, Google it, and look it up. If you need any help with it, let me know. Shoot me an email. I'll be happy to help you with your exact query string. So for the insert query, we're going to say insert into, and then we need to tell it the table name, my table. We need to tell it what values, what columns in that table we're going to be inserting into. So we're going to say my index. We want to insert into name, and we want to insert into email address. Then we have to tell it what we're going to be inserting in. So we're going to use the keyword values. And again, we're going to tell it the values that we want to insert. Now, we could just write in here straight up exactly what we want to insert into the table, and it's going to do that. The other thing that we can do is we can create parameters inside of the query that we can set at a later time. This is far more useful than just typing in the data, just because you can then create queries that you can reuse over and over and over again. So I am going to give parameter names, and we denote a parameter in SQL by using the @ sign. So I'm going to say parameter my index, parameter name, and parameter email address. And that's our query string. That's a very, very basic insert query string. After we've created the query string, we have to create the SQL command that we are going to use for executing that query. So I'm just going to do a var SQL command equals new, and we're going to use the SQL CE command. And when that comes up, you'll notice there are some other many different options for how many parameters we can put into that SQL command. The one that we're going to use is this middle one here, where we issue the command text and then the connection string. So the command text is the query string that we just wrote up there. So we'll do QString. And the connection is this connection that we created up here. So I'm just going to type in con. That's now created the SQL command. Once we've created the SQL command, since we used parameters, we're going to need to add those parameters to the SQL command. We have to actually add values for those parameters. You do that by just doing SQL command dot parameters dot, and then you have three different options here. You can either do add range, which adds an array of values. We don't want to do that. And then there's also add with value. Add with value is what we want to use. And you'll notice that it's got one option here. We need to put in the parameter name as a string, and then we need to add whatever the value is that we are going to be adding to that parameter. So the first parameter that we created was this my index, so I am going to say at my index, and you'll notice that I did surround it with quotations because that is a string value. It is not an actual object or an individual variable that you can access directly. This is a string. Basically, you're telling the SQL command to search through this string of text, find this text, and replace it with whatever we put in as the value. And since this is an integer value, I'm just going to put in the number 1 to begin with, semicolon to end the line, and we're going to do that for the rest of the parameters. And since this next one is a string value, I'm going to put in a string. And for the last one, at email address, so there we have added the 3 parameters for the SQL command. The last thing that we need to do is we actually need to execute that SQL command, and that's as simple as just typing SQL command dot. And what we want to do is we want to execute a non-query in this case. You'll notice there are definitely some other options here. We're going to use execute reader in just a minute. But the reason why this is called a non-query is because we're not expecting anything back from it. It's just an insert query. So do execute non-query, and we're done. So now if I run this, we should insert something into the database. And I think I have a typo in here. Yes, I do. So you'll notice I got a error because the parameter name email address does not exist because I typoed the email address in there. Now let's try running it. There we go, and it's done. Now if I come over here, if I right click on my table and go to show table data, you can see we've inserted that text into the table. Okay, so now let's read the data from the table. It's gonna delete out my select or my insert. So just like with the insert statement, the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a SQL statement to select the data out of the database that we want. So I'm just going to create the most simple of queries here, sQuery equals, and then we're just going to do select star, which means select everything from my table. And that's just going to select every column, every row inside the my table table in the database. Again, we have to create an SQL command to execute that query. So I'm going to say var, we'll just say cmd equals new SQLCE command. Again, we're going to use that second option there. We are going to use the select query as the command text, and then the con, which is the SQL connection that we created up there, as the connection. Then we have to execute that query. Now, in this case, we're going to execute the query a little bit differently because we need to actually get data out of the database. And we're going to do that using the SQL data reader. Now, the SQL data reader is not my favorite object for doing this, but it is probably the easiest one to understand in the as you get going. So we're going to start with using the SQL query reader. Next week, we'll get into more advanced ways of reading from the database. So to do that, we are going to create a new variable, and we're just going to call it a, let's just call it an sReader. And we're going to set that equal to the output of the command dot execute reader. Execute reader is going to return an SQL data reader. So when it returns that, it's going to save that in sReader. Now, the way you access the data in sReader is you need to use a while statement. Do not try to use a for each statement or a for statement here. This is meant to be done with a while statement, so use the while statement. The command that you need to say is while that sReader dot read, and what this is going to do is it's going to move to the next line in reader, and it's going to check to see if that line is null. If that line is not null, if there's something there, it's going to return true. If it is null, then it's going to return false. So while isReader.read, that should return a true value because we have one line in the database. And then the command that we're going to execute here, we're just going to do a, let's say console.writeLine. We're going to say index, and then we're going to again use that sReader. We're going to say get int 32, so we're going to be retrieving an integer 32 value from that, and then we need to tell it what order we want to select from. This is one of the reasons why SQL Data Reader is not my favorite way of reading and writing to a database. You have to basically tell it what order these columns are in. So this starts with 0, this is 1, this is 2. And we want to, since we're getting an integer value, the only integer value we have is that my index, so we're going to put in a 0 there. And then we're going to do that a couple more times to get the other data that we have. Let's see here, we can say name, and since name is a string instead of an integer, we want to use get string, and we need to tell that we're getting that from column 1, and then email, again get string, and we're going to get that from column 2. Let's just put in a console.read so that we stop, and let's go ahead and execute this and see what happens. And there you go. You can see that it executed this while statement once. It pulled the index number, what we put into the name, and what we put into the email and it wrote it to the console. So that should be everything that you need to get through assignment 2. Make sure when you submit the assignment that you include that SDF. If you zip up all of the week 2 project, again, you should get that without a problem. Again, remember in this class, when you're creating solutions in Visual Studio, make sure you include your name and the assignment number in that solution so that when you create the zip file, it has your name and assignment number in it. So that'll just make it easier for me when grading. If you have any other questions, feel free to email me throughout the week, and have a good night.